afternoon. So my name is Cindy, and I am going to be moderating this panel today. So let's first start with cloud native, right? So this word has been sort of in existence, or at least in vogue, for like the last maybe a couple of years, not very long. I believe, you know, the first time I heard the word was when I heard about the Cloud Native Computing Foundation, which was kind of formed to house Kubernetes, you know, and other projects that fit well into the ecosystem. But what really is cloud native, according to you? Like, there's like, if you go online and look on the internet, you get like a whole, you know, there's a bunch of definitions about like, you know, it should run on the cloud, it should scale, it should do all these things. But what does cloud native mean to you in practice?
At this point, I'm just going to say.
Thank you, Simon. So cloud native is three things. It's agility, resilience, and scale. So the idea is that if you look at the way we were doing software 20 years ago, obviously we were delivering value, but we were doing it very slowly with lots of checks, and that has certain downsides. It means that you can't, for example, build Amazon or Netflix. Now, there's been a couple of shifts in the way that we think about things. So one of the biggest ones, actually, is that we've moved from this idea of like mean time between failure, so like let's not make things break, to mean time to recovery, which is let's be okay with things breaking, but also be good at fixing them quickly. So this is the agility idea, right? So we want to be able to change the software a lot to be able to respond to customer demand, but we also want to be resilient. We need to keep working when we do that. And then scale is kind of obvious. You know, a lot of these things are now global, and they didn't used to have to be pre-internet. So that would be my sort of three-part definition of cloud native. I've answered that question about 40 times, so would anyone like to rebut?
Well, yeah, I mean, yeah, I think what you said, I would just add to that. At least in terms of standardization, you know, much though Amazon is kind of, you know, giving it some side eye and a degree of participation. The simple truth is that CNCF is the anyone but Amazon club. So cloud native is people that want to do things like Amazon, but they're not actually Amazon.
Well, I guess in what I've seen is I think cloud native is almost so last year. I mean, we have been struggling about, you know, defining this as an industry, but it's happening, and it's happening very, very quickly. I mean, I started in this industry when Java came out. I used to work at Sun. And you know, a couple of months ago, there was a conference here called CNCF KubeCon, which I thought was going to be the European small version of the big event over in the US. And lo and behold, I was just floored. And it felt like this intensity around a lot of companies looking at how to transform, how they're delivering software, how they're running production systems in the cloud, and everyone is just confused. And so there's this lovely kind of need to work together to figure out how to do this together, and opportunities for new solutions to come to help companies do this. And so I was just surprised, and it felt a lot like Java when it came out. And you see large vendors supporting this ecosystem, but there's tons of wonderful new opportunities out there where people are really looking for new ways to solve these problems, like you were saying, agility, you know, resilience, scale, and I think it's an exciting time. It's an exciting time to be looking at this. So, yeah.
Gosh. So, Amazon. You all understand how Amazon basically operates by identifying late-stage products which it industrializes to commodity services, enabling everybody else to build on top, and then you can mine metadata to spot future patterns which you then commoditize to new component services. It's an old model. It's called ILC, Innovate, Leverage, Commoditize. You get everybody else to innovate for you. You leverage the entire ecosystem to spot new patterns, you commoditize to component services. And it's very simple, because if you do that model, your rate of innovation, your rate of customer focus, your rate of efficiency, all now increase with the size of the ecosystem. And as the ecosystem gets better, you get better at all three of those. So these old ideas in business, you could be one of these three things, was busted 2005. And so if you think Amazon's tough today, their ecosystem is growing. In 5 years from now, you'll wish they were just as easy as they are today. So you've got that going on in the game. Now, a friend of mine used to work with me at Ubuntu, Rick Clark, went to Rackspace. We had worked out this play to industrialize the space in the infrastructure layer, play the same sort of game. That turned into OpenStack. The night of the launch, because I put them on at OSCON, they made an absolute howler, a strategic howler. They said they were going to differentiate on APIs because that's what mattered. And as a result, created a collective prisoner dilemma. It's turned into the mess that it is. And it all stems from that one particular failure. So I would be careful with Amazon playing in this space because there's always misdirection. There's always giving support to others whilst they are literally owning and tearing up that space. And the space and the battle today is all around Lambda. I mean, James, you mentioned it in your talk as well. I mean, they are literally killing that space. And these battles, when we see a shift from product to more commodity form, and that's what's going on with the framework, they take 10 to 15 years to become the new norm, but the winners are decided in the first 5 to 8. And we're 4 years into that battle, and Amazon is way ahead of the game, and that is where we are all shifting. So I'm all for these sorts of collaborative open efforts, we come together, etc. I was for OpenStack, but it all depends on how well you play the game. Because if people don't play the game well, it centralizes. So the industrialization of things can decentralize or centralize, and it all depends on how well people play the game. And Amazon is an extremely good player.
Interesting. Speaking of Amazon, and also speaking of Netflix, and some of these other larger companies, for a lot of these ideas, you could say, sort of make sense given their scale and given their needs. But my background is primarily working at very small companies. And I would argue that the number of Amazons and Netflixes and Googles in the world, they're very, very few. And one of the things that concerns me a little bit is, with the cloud native, with all of these, these new paradigms of computing, is that given that they sort of like trace their roots to like some of these larger organizations, what I am seeing or what I'm concerned about is when smaller companies and smaller teams go to adopt a lot of these tools and technologies, a lot of the latest hotness, the fact that people are almost very willingly buying into a ton of complexity and a ton of additional work, right, which may or may not be even needed given what they're trying to achieve. So, for instance, Kubernetes, it is a pretty complicated and complex system. It takes, I've heard people tell me that it takes about almost an entire year to get it production ready for a large enterprise if you're doing it yourself, if you're like running your own Kubernetes cluster. And this is like a pretty large investment, even for like mid-sized teams. So how do smaller teams, is there a way for smaller teams to adopt a lot of these technologies piecemeal or in a small and iterative way that you've seen happen successfully, as opposed to, just completely starting over from scratch and just buying into a ton of complexity and all the attendant work that's needed to pull this off in a way that actually makes sense for the business?
So there's two routes that I can see. Mm-hmm. One route is you spend 1.2 billion trying to do what it is you're trying to do and you fail. And the other route is you just use Lambda.
That was simple, yeah. I think, again, around Kubernetes and this rapid adoption, as you say, that we're going through, I think companies really need to think about how they're designing their infrastructure. I mean, there's fads, our industry, and I've been running conferences, so many of these fads and concepts are always not very, they're shiny and new and interesting and exciting, but If this isn't going to bring your company any business value, then does it make sense to do is really the question. And I think a lot of times we, we have a customer called Netlify who uses Kubernetes intensely on a multi-cloud platform. And they've made that a business choice. Like, that is part of the value they bring and that product that they've come to market with. It's a core piece of their design choice. And I think that's the difference, really, is that, I think we have fads that we do or get involved with or start to do because, let's say, Netflix is doing this. But oftentimes we don't check what our own design and what can our team handle, is this the right direction from a business point of view? I think that's really where the question is.
I think I'm somewhat in agreement with Simon. Infrastructure is hard, and I guess the real question is, why should we be making infrastructure decisions? Like, why do we feel we need to run the infrastructure ourselves? Is it because historically we always have? In some cases, it may not be. So, and you actually asked about small companies, and I'm about to talk about Boeing, and I guess Boeing probably is not such a small company. But Boeing is interesting because they sell into the military. And the US government says you actually can't put your stuff on the Amazon cloud. So they have to make a set of architecture decisions based on that. Regulations, I think, have value, but they tend to move behind a lot of the technologies. So if we look at, say, Heroku, tremendously productive development environment and production environment, but they were quite slow to getting compliance in the UK from the Financial Conduct Authority. So a good friend of mine, John Lister, has a startup called PensionBee. They're trying to be disruptive. They were not able to use the platform he would have chosen, which was Heroku, actually, which runs on AWS, but abstracts some of that, because they didn't have regulatory authority to do so. So I think sometimes there are external issues that force us to drive infrastructure. I think Simon's a little bit rhetorical. I don't think it's always going to be 1.2 billion. But I just think the real question is, as an organization, Netlify is an infrastructure startup. They're fantastic as a model in terms of static sites. It's really great, but they're an infrastructure company, so it makes sense for them to invest in infrastructure. The question I think that Simon challenges us all on is, are you an infrastructure company? And if you're not, you need to think very carefully about why and how you want to make these investments.
Thank you, James. So I think the question around adopting Kubernetes is just the same question around adopting anything. Like, there's always going to be some new shiny thing. And the argument I hear quite a lot is that if you don't do the new shiny thing, then you won't be able to hire. And I think this sort of suggests that all developers are cargo cult hype fans, and I just don't think that's the truth. I think, what James said is very true. You need to decide how important it is to your business. How much technology do you need to care about? And if you can get rid of it, then get rid of it. And serverless is very useful there, right? Assuming you're running it in someone else's cloud. I think you need to be able to build a way, and Simon will be able to talk much more about this, but you need to be able to deal with strategy, like technical strategy, and that's very hard, but it's very essential, because not only will there always be a new shiny thing, but there's going to be new shiny things more frequently, I think, as we move forwards. So, if your decision-making framework is what the developers like, then you're going to find yourself in a sticky place. I think you need to be a bit smarter about that. You need to understand what your business objectives are and how various technologies tie into those. And that's non-trivial, but it is going to be essential.
So part of this is all about your focus in terms of thinking about who your users are and what their needs are. So if you're somebody like iRobot, who produce those robotic vacuum cleaners, they've got 23 million robots out in the wild. Their entire development team and operations team for 23 million robots is 10 people, 8 of which do new development, 2 are doing the operations. And I think their running costs on Lambda are around about $15,000 a month. So that's for 23 million robots. Now their focus is on their end users. And we'll go back to the point about infrastructure company. If your focus is on developing technology for people working in infrastructure, these changes, 10 to 15 years before they start to become the new norm. And then you've got another 10 to 15 years where you've got a long tail of people who are slow to make the changes, and it can go even beyond that. And there's a lot of money, and there will be, for the next 20 years in infrastructure. People will spend huge sums of money building their own private serverless environments, trying to create their own things. There's a lot of money in that space. So if you're a technology company and you want to make money, there's going to be that. There is money on the table, and there'll be niche markets afterwards. If you're a company focused on producing something else, for an end user, whether you're a taxi firm or you're doing robot cleaners or drone delivery, you're going to use whatever technology gives you the best results as quickly as possible, as cheaply as possible. And so the choices you'll make will be different.
Thanks. So one thing that Geeta mentioned was the fact that Netlify are using Kubernetes because they're multi-cloud. So let's talk about multi-cloud. How many people here are already have a multi-cloud strategy or already are multi-cloud, which means you run on more than one cloud, say Amazon and Google and IBM or Microsoft or Azure? Okay, how many people are thinking of potentially going multi-cloud? Okay, that's a fair number.
Maybe these people are here for nothing to do with cloud native, and we're completely missing the point. And so who's running on Amazon? So sort of many people, and this was a bit of a last-minute thing. So I'm like, are you interested in the question as to which? Yes, I'm getting a firm nod from over there. Okay, good. Okay. We'll carry on. That's fair. Okay. Yeah, but that's a strong head nod by the one person. And you don't want to confuse, obviously, sort of data and this, but I think that's good.
Awesome. Good. So I've heard two kinds of opinions. I've heard people who genuinely believe that going multi-cloud is going to be beneficial to the business. I've also heard this other strain of opinion, which is that multi-cloud isn't so much about leverage against cloud vendors, but what you are going to be losing when you go multi-cloud is the feature set. Because when you are on a particular cloud, they have a very particular set of features which are optimized for a very particular set of use cases and which have pricing models that again go in line with the feature set and the uses. But when you go multi-cloud, you are sacrificing on a lot of these things when you try to commodify across the different clouds. So what are your opinions on the pros and cons of multi-cloud, and when should people be thinking about it, and what are some of the pitfalls to watch out for?
So certainly what we've seen in dealing with clients in a range of environments is a couple of things. One is, never underestimate the power of a powerful vendor with a good lawyer. I guess I have to name names. So if we look at, you're a large bank, and you have one of these large deals that Simon's talking about with Oracle. If Oracle, is anyone from Oracle here? I don't know whether I'm going to tell you the really good Oracle story, but if Oracle contacts you and says, "Look, you're doing cloud infrastructure, we've got this offering for you, and you should use it," and your immediate reaction might be, no, we're not going to do that because we're happier with a slightly higher value service on Amazon. We don't need that. Thank you very much. And then they're saying, yeah, but let's talk about that a little bit. Let's sort of decompose what you're saying. And so here's the thing: we're offering you cloud capacity for free. You kind of really should use that. And then I really shouldn't have named the vendor, should I? And then you say, well, actually, no, we're still happy with Amazon. And they say, well, so who are we talking to? Because I really need to talk to your CFO now. Because we need to talk about your fiduciary responsibility to shareholders. And if you're offered free cloud capacity and you're not using it, it may be that your shareholders will be unhappy with that. So that's the sort of the big, ugly stuff that happens every day. Not, obviously, Oracle doesn't do that, but as an example, it's a hypothetical situation that might happen if there was a vendor with a strong legal, procurement-focused approach to dealing with clients. No, so it's not. It's let's just say a large vendor, not Oracle. Which country am I in? What are the libel laws here? No, Oracle are a valued client before today. So that's one sort of view of the world, which is, frankly, there are these large contracts. And we see this in outsourcing as well. Simon's very anti-outsourcing. I'm very anti-outsourcing. What happens is that you're unable. I mean, a company can say, actually, we'd prefer to use the Amazon cloud. But when they've signed a 10-year deal to use someone else's stuff, that's not really an easy change they can make. Now, it's almost an entirely separate question to ask, should we take advantage of higher value services in the cloud? The answer to that is absolutely yes. Because shutting yourself off from innovation makes no sense. We are moving at a rapid pace. It's very easy to be left behind as a business. And you've got to use the highest value tools that are available to you in order to be effective. Yeah, I think that multi-cloud, it's quite interesting. I know that some of my competitors have advised their clients they need to have that portability. I would say multi-cloud needs to be a strategy where you take advantage of the best services in the various clouds rather than the idea of portability of everything. I don't think portability could be the key issue when you might be out of business in a very short space of time. Oh, you just like me rubbishing Oracle, thanks. Can you just turn the mic off? Oh, God.
I mean, I guess kind of expanding on the note as to how these choices are made. I think, how many of you as developers actually are heavily involved in what choices are made? I think we're bringing up this point of, utilizing the services that the cloud providers provide. But I think what happens is, as we're seeing, we run into lots of companies where some decision on what has happened has nothing to do with the development teams are not involved. They're just basically told, we've moved from X to Y because, procurement did that. And that is a struggle as developers when you are taking advantage of services from a particular vendor and no longer because a procurement department, CFO went and played golf with someone and suddenly we moved everything. And that's ultimately one of the factors where, back to sort of the developer's kingmaker, this is where we have some strength here, right? Taking advantage of certain platforms for what they provide is a way for us to actually, push against that, right? We're driving this. You guys are building the services. You are making this work. So I think, this all kind of meets at one place, but the CFO doesn't write code, doesn't build services. He doesn't fix things when they break. So I think, more power to the developers here, but I think, we see this all the time in this decision-making of the cloud.
I think it was Cloud Opinion, it's a Twitter handle, 6 years ago made the comment that everybody who has failed in cloud has hybrid as their strategy. So you see a lot of this. Companies who have been unsuccessful in cloud computing are now all talking about hybrid as being the future. I don't think there's the evidence to support them. I see various people attempting to do hybrid as in, you know, run across public and private type clouds. A lot of it is to do with inertia, pre-existing practices, difficulty in change. Certainly there's a valid justification of hybrid on a public front in terms of consuming multiple functions and services from several of the public providers, which is what James was talking about. The complexity, however, of combining hybrid in terms of public-private, trying to mimic those environments, it just increases dramatically. And unless you have very specific reasons and you're one of those niche areas, again, I think most of it is vendors trying to give themselves a future. Remember, you know, it's a difficult transition. When people talk about disruption, there's two different forms. There's the unpredictable product substitution, so that's the Apple versus Nokia. You don't know which way it's going to go. I mean, Christensen said that Apple would fail in terms of the iPhone, they were successful. And it's not because Christensen was daft, it's because it's unpredictable. But there's the product to utility, and you can anticipate that well in advance. You know it's going to be an exponential change. You know it's going to cause a change of practice. We're going to have inertia to that space. But companies fail to cope with it because they can't see the environment, so they don't anticipate effectively, and they get themselves into a trap. And so the way to think of the trap is, if I'm an investor, apologies, you're Amazon, and James, I'm going to make you as a past giant of technology, no names mentioned, a past giant of technology, and yourself as well. So what will happen is, as an investor, I'm investing in you for the future. I'm investing in you because I want short-term dividends. I want share buybacks. I want you to be firing people. I want you to be squeezing revenue and everything else. I want you to be buying other companies like yourself, smashing them together, firing more people, returning me more dividends. And that's why I'm investing in you. Every time you say, I've got a future plan, I don't want to hear it, because I want the money back. I want the money back. There's my future, not you. And eventually, when you've ended up with no runway left, I pull my money out, I start shorting you. And I'm afraid that's the game that goes on. And of course, all you're doing is you're buying time. And you're buying time in the hope that some engineer will give you a lucky break and you create a new future. And of course, you're going to use every technique in this you can to buy yourself even more time. So hybrid, yeah, it's the future if you've got that story. But that's the game that's going on.
So, where do we begin? Hybrid cloud. MultiCloud?
MultiCloud.
Okay, multi. So that's probably 2 or 3. I think it's best to look at this through the lens of people who are selling InfiniCloud, and that's edge computing, right? So what edge computing people are saying is that, you know, for various reasons, we're going to need a very small cloud close to everybody all the time. And we can go through some of those reasons. I'd like to, so that I can foo-foo them. Now, without falling into the trap of naming specific companies, let's imagine that you're let's imagine you're a telco and you've got these buildings that are called substations in most major cities, and what they're currently doing is costing you a shit ton of rent. It would be lovely for you if you were able to convince the market that they should put a data center in all of them, because then we'd be able to have latencies of below a thousandth of a microsecond, right? Because that's important. So the arguments for cloud are, well, there are a lot, but the main one is like latency is going to be very important, right? Because things like Teslas are going to need really quick latency, really low latency in order to be able to make safety critical decisions, right? But obviously no Tesla is ever going to rely on the network to decide whether or not it should run you over. That's why a Tesla is a data center. It's got like 16 computers in it, more compute than most companies had in their entire data center in 1998. Right? So that argument kind of doesn't work. Now, the other argument is that we should put data centers all over the place because we'd like to reduce backhaul traffic, right? We don't want to be paying for it to get all the way back from the edge to the cloud. But this one also doesn't work because ingress traffic for all major clouds is free. And the reason why is because you have a lot more egress than you have ingress, and they pay for a two-way pipe. So most of the time it's doing nothing on the input. So that doesn't work either. The one that might work is this idea that you'd like to be able to do quick processing at the edge. So you might like to be able to make very quick decisions on data, because what's the edge doing? Right? The edge is essentially just creating information that you'd like to be able to make decisions on, and you might not like to do that tomorrow. You might want to do it now. So perhaps that's an argument for having more data centers that are closer to where the computing is actually happening, but that's not clear either. So I think probably when we talk about multi or hybrid cloud, what's going to happen is that we're going to fall back to that definition of cloud-native computing from earlier, which is that if you're in more than one availability zone, you're probably more resilient, and that's probably desirable. So we're probably not going to have a data center on every street, but every car might become a data center. We might have more data centers, and having a multi-data center approach might be more common, but I doubt that's going to happen anytime soon.
So it's a really interesting question of centralization, decentralization, and of both provision and power. Because you take something like electricity, it became industrialized, more of a utility. Of course, you get a yo-yo, and the standards get created, and you get a yo-yo between centralized and decentralized form. And that's controlled by a completely separate set of economic patterns to the ones which control the industrialization of something. So whether we centralize or decentralize to begin with often depends upon the strategic gameplay of the competitors in that market. And so the only reason why we're centralizing at the moment is because Amazon, for example, and Alibaba have literally outplayed people. So the question then becomes, when it decentralizes, and I certainly agree in terms of decentralization of provision, is whether it's decentralization of power. So whether we end up with a world where it's basically an Amazon cloud everywhere and an Alibaba cloud everywhere, or you end up with a marketplace of multiple different providers. Now at the moment, if I look at things like Greengrass and what's going on there, and also some of the play with Alibaba, I suspect it will decentralize in terms of provision, but not power. So we'll end up with an Amazon cloud which goes everywhere to your device, in your home, all the way to data centers, the same with Alibaba, then a second tier with probably Google, Microsoft, and a bit further down maybe Google, and then that's about it. I think we end up with 4 computers. Somebody said we'd end up with 5, I think it was, in the past. The famous quote, we'll only ever need 5 computers. I think they're wrong. I think it might be 4, but we'll find out.
So you mentioned edge compute. How many people here are familiar with the idea of what edge compute means? Okay. No, I'm joking. It's totally going to become the next topic, yes. So how many people here are familiar with what CloudFlare released recently, which is CloudFlare Workers, which is, okay, so for the uninitiated, what CloudFlare Workers does, it lets you write JavaScript functions, which they then run in their POPs. Basically, that's called the edge. And it's almost like serverless, but on the POPs, right? So serverless at the edge is a thing right now, and it is poised to, well, I wouldn't say it's poised, but there are definitely people who believe that it is going to be the next big sort of like revolution, right? Because you can run compute at a cost that is much lower than what it would be were you running on Amazon, on VMs or containers or what have you, right? If you can just run a piece of compute at the edge, then, well, that is going to be a game changer. In case of Cloudflare, it is just writing some JavaScript, compiling it down to WebAssembly, and then just running it in their POPs. Fastly, the other CDN provider, have something fairly similar as well, which they call edge compute. They've been talking about this for a while. They've been also talking about things like doing CRDTs at the edge and a whole bunch of other things. So it's definitely a sort of trend. And so my question is, what's the future for serverless on the edge? So there are two things, like A, what is the core future for serverless, but like if you can take serverless to the next level and put it on the edge, then, well, I personally can see a lot of other issues in terms of like, if it's at the edge, then in which country it's executing, like what are the data privacy laws there, like what sort of compute is going to execute there, and there are tons of questions to be answered, right? But, so.
I'd love to, sorry.
I'd love to ask
just
you
like-
that question.
So I think, well, you already mentioned that, but I think it's very important to separate serverless from edge here. And all I would add is that if we're going to put, like, functions clearly have function, but putting them close to the edge, like, I can only think of one application where that would be useful, which would be some sort of TLS encryption, like get that closer so that the app just responds quicker. Like, light goes at 180 miles a millisecond, 70% of that in fiber optic cable. Like, you have to be quite a long way away for latency to become an actual thing that would require us having functions at the edge. The other problem here is like, so you've got functions at the edge, but that's only useful for stateless workloads. So that's, again, sort of making a smaller and smaller group of areas where this could be interesting. Now, I think it's going to be, for the areas where it might be applicable, it's going to be very useful, but it's going to be useful for many less areas than people think it will. And that's my current hobby horse. Yeah.
So I've got some sympathy for the position. I think the economics that Cloudflare is putting forward are very compelling. It's pretty hard. Everyone's like, oh yeah, we're going to do, and at the risk of moving back to a subject we seem to have moved on from, we're going to do functions on Knative, on Kubernetes with Istio routing and blah, 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 whatever it is. And we're going to do it like way slower and more expensive than Amazon. That's a pretty hard sell, unless it's your job to do a really hard sell. I think with Cloudflare, the economics are really good, and the performance is really good. And, NPM, as I said in my talk this morning, sorry if anyone was there, NPM is now running on workers. So, NPM, literally any JavaScript developer is going to be touching NPM on a daily basis. And, what happens when you tie together, NPM with Netlify, and you start to offer something which is 6 times as fast and a fifth of the price? At that point, you begin to get some interesting economics. I'm not a huge fan of the edge word, because then I start thinking about cars, as data centers. But I do think there's something interesting happening where running containers is becoming commoditized in Simon's view of the world, and the developer experience becomes far more important. And so for me, I sort of see Cloudflare Workers and the Fastly stuff in the same breath as GitHub Actions, where I can actually run a container in GitHub, and they're going to manage that for me. And I don't have to think about infrastructure. Now, initially, it looks like it's going to be, things like CI/CD, I'm going to do my linting, I'm going to do the compile, I'm going to do all of that in GitHub. GitHub is now finally a runtime. And, I remember arguing with folks at Heroku, and they'd said, no, GitHub doesn't have the product management discipline to actually build this. And then I was at GitHub Universe recently, and those were the people that GitHub had hired to build that platform for them. The notion that developers will not go directly from dev test, QA, CI/CD into production, I think is wrong. And I do think that more people are going to run containers than just Amazon. I do think that I don't know that it's edge exactly, but I think there's some disruption. If you offer a profoundly better developer experience and good economics, chances are high that the platform will be adopted.
So I actually built the first serverless environment in 2005. It was known as Zimke, JavaScript front and back end, billing to function. It became started to grow rapidly. Unfortunately, a parent company was told this was not the future, which was a bit of a nuisance. Apparently the future was 3D television, so they spent about $1 billion on 3D TV, bit of a disaster. Anyway, one of the people who used to work with me ran my systems team, was Artur Bergman, who then created. So I remember going over to San Francisco when Fastly was just like 3 people in his flat. And we also had breakfast, and somebody had offered him 20 million. I said, do not sell it until it's worth more than 800. So Arthur, if you ever watch this, thank you. He's done very well. We had long discussions about the JavaScript on the edge. This was way back then. And because one of the things, if you standardize the substrate, and this is why I take particular interest in things like AWS Greengrass, if you subsidize the substrate, so that's Lambda, for example, in their case, everywhere, then you can start to play equations of, what is the most economical thing to do? Do I shift the code to the data, or do I shift the data to the code? And we can start to play, it's a different set of equations, a different way of doing the game. So I think there's a lot of potential once we standardize the substrate to make those sorts of decision. And it's also another reason why I think we're going to see decentralization in terms of provision, but also not in terms of power. Now there's one other aspect to this. When Amazon launched EC2, which was based upon ideas from Ben Black back in 2003, so they launched in 2006, they were rapidly growing, and I went in to see some of these hardware vendors, 2007, 2008, sat in their boardrooms and told them they were going to lose their entire hardware business. But it's easy to counterplay, because you build a clone and you create a price war, because Amazon is constrained by building data centers fast enough. And so if you create a price war, you increase demand, you fragment the market. And then I explained, you're all going to say it's never going to happen because you've got inertia, and I'll list you your 16 different forms of inertia before you tell me. And of course they said it wouldn't happen. And of course they've all lost. But the thing about this is you have to be careful when looking at price, because Amazon will be constrained by the speed at which it can build data centers. So it's almost certainly artificially keeping the price high to control demand. Once it gets to that point, it can then start rapidly drop, because if it drops the price too quickly, demand can, it's difficult if you are doubling in physical size a year just to do that. So you can't drop the price too quickly because you increase demand. So I suspect that's still the case. So you've got to be very careful with saying, well, look at our price is much lower and everything else, because I would be surprised if parts of Amazon aren't running at 80% margin, and they could drop that price really quickly if they needed to.
So the other thing that you mentioned, James, was developer experience. And with a lot of these infrastructural advancements that we're seeing, it almost feels like the developer experience is, well, it's improving for one thing. But on the other hand, in some cases, it also feels as if the traditional role of operations is being almost redefined. There were people who are saying that, operations engineering is systems administration, operations engineering, whatever you want to call it, is going to be a thing of the past in like 5 years from now, right? There's Google with their whole SRE model, who essentially came out with like the way to do operations right. Again, there's a spectrum of opinions about how this is done. But one thing that is definitely true is that, the role is changing, right? It's not the same job that people are doing 5 years ago, maybe even like 3 years ago. So the other thing that I'm seeing is that developers, that is software engineers, people who typically just wrote code for the most part, are now being asked to shoulder more responsibilities in terms of like also being the people to write tests. The traditional QA role has been phased out in several organizations, where you have the software engineers writing the test, doing all the testing. And there are people who also believe that operations is kind of going the same way, where everything is an API, everything is commoditized. All you're really going to have is software engineers who sort of like do pretty much everything. And there are also people who believe that software engineering is going to now be sort of like divided into like product engineering and infrastructure engineering, where infrastructure engineers do engineering, but also a lot of the operational work, whereas building platforms to enable product teams to move faster. So what is required, at least what I'm seeing is being required, is like software engineers are now being asked to like just skill up, level up in certain skills in certain areas where they typically did not have to focus. So my question is like, what do you think is going to be, like how do you think the role of the developer is going to change given everything that's happening in like the infrastructure space, like serverless, edge compute, like containers, whatever, like, so what is like the future of like development?
Well, at this point, because with serverless, you've got a real change going on in terms of financial billing per function. So it's the combination of development and finance skills, which is particularly interesting, because for the first time, we can look through capital flow within an application. And so we're starting to monitor by the use of capital. Operational metrics are becoming all about financial flow. Refactoring, you discover a function which is expensive, and suddenly refactoring now has financial value. In the past, refactoring was always something, we might get to it. Well, now we can put a dollar amount to actually refactoring a particular function. So there's a whole change of practices going on. But what I was moving for was, I think you should be in here and answering that question, because I think you've got skills on that. What do you think is going to happen?
What do I think is going to happen? Well, there's definitely going to be change, though in some cases it's going to be a slow change, whereas in some cases it's going to be a little more rapid. And in some cases it's just going to be dragging people, kicking and screaming into this brand new world, whether they like it or not. That is my opinion, and I'm very comfortable in saying that I can be proven wrong, and maybe I will be even proven wrong. So I don't know.
So I mean, I think when you're talking about this, I think there's different types of developers, and I think in that sense, there's a lot of developers that write code and don't actually care for the service or the system, or have some level of an end user and care about that. And that in itself, like when I see what happens when developers actually have a really tight feedback loop to the end customer, then you care for the uptime, you care about that the product is fast, you care about all these things. Now, one of the struggles is having this view or context that brings, the both sides of the table together. And it's getting to be more and more important that we're looking at the same things, that we're talking about the same things, that we can visualize, that we can ask questions of our systems, both developers and operations, so we're not, basically having our own small view of why things are broken. And I think these days, things are getting just more and more complex, and the ability for the developer experience to be able to ask those questions from an infrastructure point of view, why is my application doing this? I need to know. And it's not a report that's coming back from ops. I mean, that's essentially what we have been used to. So it's been the safe way to kind of pawn off this to the other team, like, it's the dev team or it's the ops team. And I think the way we're going is we need to be all looking at the same stuff, the same data, the same systems, having the same sense of understanding, the same tools, and understanding how we're delivering software together. So I think the developer experience is really a huge part of what will enable this, I think, or make it easier. I mean, a lot of the stuff you've written about, of course, has been around that. I mean, your experience being, pushed a bit into these spaces and understanding, and I think that's, that's what we're realizing is this having the same context is huge. So.
Don't know what I add to that, really.
Shall I go then?
Go ahead.
Okay. So I think that the whole dev and ops classification is incorrect, right? Because development is supposed to use programming languages to automate problems in problem domains, and operations is a problem domain, right? So what we're seeing is that people are automating more of that. Now, there was this idea with the DevOps movement that, or at least some of the some of what they were talking about was sort of like dev and ops getting along better, right? Which makes sense because they had the wrong incentives. Like developers were incentivized on change and operations were incentivized on stability, and those things are like diametrically opposed. Now, it turns out that the companies that have done this the best got dev and ops to play nicely with each other just long enough for them to then replace that communication with an API. So the idea is that I want to speak to an API, not a person, and then suddenly we have this specialization, which is great, right? Because now we can unleash the power of capitalism and specialize on things that we're good at and then trade. So as a developer, I now want to be able to say, this is what I want and I want it to work. And the company that can get me that the best will win. And on the operations side, if you go back 20 years, you might have had some guy, or maybe that's still happening now, you'd have someone who would be, you know, fixing a printer and also spinning up VMs on vSphere and also like doing some networking and then maybe spending a bit of time in the data center in the basement. Like that sort of full stack ops role has now been split. Like if you were fixing printers, I hope you got a job at Ricoh. Like if you were doing vSphere, you're now an API. If you're doing data center, I hope you were good at it and you now work at Amazon. Or maybe you learned to code and now you're in dev, right? Now you're automating what you used to do. So like the future of ops is you will either specialize or you become a developer or you won't have a job. That's quite clearly how that's going to go. But it will go, I think I'll leave it at that. That's where it's going to go.
We'll go. So we're out of time. I was kind of hoping we could do some audience questions, but really out of time. So thanks, everyone, and thanks to our panel.
Thank you.